Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today we are taking a deep dive into a book that really offers a shortcut to robust analytical thought, Albert Rutherford's Mathematical Thinking. For people who hate math,
I love that title.
it's a compelling look at the mental structures we build, or, fail to build, and how those structures govern our daily lives, even if we never touch a calculator.
I think that's the perfect framing for it. We're exploring the underlying architecture of logical thought, the conceptual skills that often come from mathematical practice. And these skills ultimately determine our perception, how we approach complex decisions, and critically, our collective outcomes, whether we're managing a huge organization or, just our own household budget.
Well, there's this core paradox in the 21st century, isn't there? Technology has made the world incredibly forgiving for the unmathematical person.
So forgiving.
Calculators handle the hard stuff. Virtual payments mean you don't count change. Apps solve equations for you instantly. And all this convenience, it's led to a kind of collective cognitive complacency.
That's the key fault line right there. Technology handles the procedural side of math, the rote calculation, the grammar, if you will, but it does absolutely nothing to develop the essential conceptual side. You can have this tiny supercomputer in your hand, but if you don't understand the concepts, the vocabulary, the structure, you're still lost.
And you find yourself poring over these complicated financial forms, tax spreadsheets, or, retirement documents later in life, feeling completely overwhelmed.
And regretting not having a stronger analytical foundation.
The stakes shift so dramatically. They move from being just an academic exercise to high-stakes reality.
Right.
We're talking about managing your budget, understanding mortgage terms, evaluating investment risk, or even just critically analyzing a political proposal.
At the same time, the modern labor market is increasingly demanding exactly these skills. Abstract thinkers, problem solvers, people who can truly analyze complex systems.
So this deep dive is really about extracting those conceptual life lessons hidden between the formulas. These are the non-negotiable skills now for any modern career.
But we're approaching this with a systems focus, aren't we? This isn't about blaming the individual for being bad at math.
Absolutely not. This is a systems-level analysis. We have to look past individual shortcomings and examine the structural mechanism.
Like our educational approaches.
Exactly. Antiquated educational approaches that prioritize rote memorization. And these ingrained cognitive biases, like our reliance on linear thinking. These are the things that prevent the widespread development of robust analytical skills.
And these structural flaws lead to predictable, systemic errors in public policy, in private finance, and in our everyday decision-making.
The goal, as Rutherford lays it out, is cognitive empowerment.
Right. Understanding the foundational concepts of logical and quantitative thought is how we inoculate ourselves against these systemic errors. It's how we build a better framework for reality.
Exactly.
So let's unpack the context of this book. Albert Rutherford published Mathematical Thinking in 2021. And he seems to be speaking directly to the non-mathematician.
Oh, absolutely. He's talking to the person who experienced that, that shame and frustration of feeling inadequate when facing analytical challenges.
What's the specific cultural gap he's trying to fill with this work?
Rutherford is responding to this widespread sense of intellectual regret, and he attributes it directly to the failure of the institutional school system to communicate the core transferable value of mathematics.
He argues that the math taught in most schools barely scratches the surface of the discipline as it exists today.
It's astonishing how much the field has changed and how few people really get that.
What are they talking about in terms of scale?
It's massive. Rutherford points out that math has just exploded in the last few hundred years. It comprises an estimated 60 to 70 distinct categories today.
Okay.
And here's the truly staggering statistic. 50 to 60 of those categories, the overwhelming majority, have only emerged within the last century alone.
Wow. That really puts into perspective why the old teaching methods, the ones focused solely on Euclidean geometry and basic calculus, feel so inadequate for navigating our modern world.
It's like our education system is trying to prepare students for the 21st century using 19th century curriculum priorities.
So historically, what was math all about?
Well, historically, ancient math, from the Babylonians who were focused on trade and taxation, to the early Greeks like Pythagoras who were focused on geometry and rational numbers, it was all purely utilitarian.
But everything changed. He talks about a major conceptual revolution in the 1980s when the discipline was fundamentally redefined.
It was.
And what was that redefinition?
Math was redefined as the science of patterns.
The science of pattern.
And this transformed it from a purely utilitarian subject into something interpretive, ideological, and abstract. It was no longer just about calculating, it became about deeper understanding, the ability to study the patterns of the real or the unreal, the world as it was, or as we perceived it to be.
So think about the abstract work required to model something like the flow of information on the internet or the behavior of the stock market.
Exactly. It's a huge conceptual shift. Math became a tool for exploring theoretical concepts they couldn't otherwise visualize. Things like the forces of gravity, or making sense of the stars, or even modeling sociological trends.
So it's a language for describing the intangible.
Yes, the focus shifted from calculation to modeling and conceptualization. The tragedy, as Rutherford highlights, is that this conceptual revolution, this inherent wonder and intellectual magic, was so poorly translated into the classroom.
Students were still being taught equation first, rote procedural math.
Right. Instead of the abstract thinking skills needed to apply those formulas creatively. It's like we learned the verbs and nouns, but we completely missed the poetry.
So if we strip down the book's central thesis to just plain language, what is mathematical thinking truly about?
It is not about calculation. It is about learning how to implement processes, break complex tasks down into manageable, definable pieces, and efficiently find and correct mistakes.
And asking the right questions.
Asking the right rigorous questions, and fundamentally turning abstract or intangible ideas, whether that's gravity or social worth or risk assessment or even moral quandaries, into a tangible, analyzable form.
So it's the ability to find a universal logical language to put just about anything into a tangible model, making the thinking process itself more logical, quantitative, and analytically robust.
Which brings us directly to the first core insight, which is all about the necessity of precision in communication.
This is where we see that profound contrast between mathematical language and natural language, like English.
Math is a universal language where statements must be definitively and demonstrably true or false. If an equation or a statement isn't open, meaning it doesn't contain unsolved variables, it has to be provable as true or untrue. These are what they call closed sentences.
English, on the other hand, is just a minefield of ambiguity.
It is. It relies so heavily on context, on shared culture, on interpretation, and that leads to gaps and inconsistencies that can be paralyzing or even dangerous.
Rutherford gives some great illustrations of this. I mean, think about being in a high-pressure situation like driving in heavy traffic and your GPS or passenger just yells, "Turn here." Right.
Is right the direction, or is the instruction itself correct? That ambiguity, it forces a momentary pause for you to interpret the context, which is something math simply refuses to allow.
Or that flawed newspaper headline he critiques, "One person dies every 36 seconds of cardiovascular disease."
Right. We understand the intent. It's for shock value, for perspective on a large scale. But logically, a mathematically minded person instantly recognizes that it's suggesting one person dies, is resurrected, and then dies again every 36 seconds.
It's conceptually nonsensical.
Yeah.
It's a linear abstraction applied completely incorrectly.
Math eliminates this ambiguity through strict logical rules, which is why it's the language of science and engineering. And this rigor extends to some really fascinating corners of logic.
Like the concept of vacuous truth.
Vacuous truth, which sounds esoteric, but it's critical for testing the validity of our assumptions. It occurs in conditional or if-then statements when the premise cannot be proven true, is impossible, or is inapplicable.
And the classic impossible example is the one of the dragon.
Yes. If dragons existed, they would be pink. Most people instinctively want to debate the color, but the color is completely irrelevant.
Because dragons don't exist.
The premise can't be verified. Therefore, we can't definitively say they aren't pink. A conditional statement is only false if it cannot always be considered true. Since the premise is empty, the statement holds. It is vacuously true.
That's a tough concept to get your head around, but the practical takeaway is huge. The truth of your conclusion depends entirely on the verifiable truth of your premise.
So if you build a complex financial model and your core assumption about market behavior is fundamentally unprovable or flawed, the model is vacuously true. It holds up in a vacuum, but is worthless in reality.
It forces that extreme rigor. If you state if the Fed raises rates, the housing market will crash, and then the Fed doesn't raise rates, the whole statement becomes logically vacuously true.
And that doesn't mean your statement was predictive or sound, it just means it was built on an unrealized premise.
That level of rigor forces us to be incredibly precise, not just with our assumptions, but with how we structure our language, even down to synonyms and negations.
In math, synonyms have to prioritize brevity and efficiency. I mean, why write a habitable planet populated by Homo sapiens that rotates on its axis when you can just write Earth?
Right.
In math, you have to choose the shortest, clearest way to express an idea. If you choose the long way, your equations become unwieldy, and that's where errors get introduced.
And for negations, the mathematical antonyms, they have to be clear, demonstrably false opposites of the original statement.
Which is so different from English, where interpretation gets subjective based on connotation and context. He uses the sentence, "All memoirs are boring."
Okay, a statement that relies on shared cultural understanding and bias.
Totally. So if we negate this, which one is the mathematically rigorous opposite? All memoirs are exciting, or not all memoirs are boring?
Well, if the original statement is false, because most people would agree that some memoirs are compelling, making the all claim false, then the negation has to be true.
Exactly.
All memoirs are exciting is obviously also false. So not all memoirs are boring works, as does some memoirs are exciting.
Exactly. Both options that are true and directly oppose the original statement can be valid negations. This reliance on our background knowledge and cognitive biases in English is what mathematical rigor strips away.
The concepts of two and four are rigid. The word memoir is not.
It comes with a host of different cultural contexts and connotations depending on who you are and what you enjoy.
So the first pillar of mathematical thinking is this cognitive discipline in language. Be concise, clear, efficient. Be so strict with your arguments that they stand up when challenged by external rigor.
And if we fail to impose that rigor, we immediately fall prey to specific cognitive fallacies. Rutherford highlights how these thrive in public discourse precisely because they exploit the ambiguity of natural language.
Let's look at some of those specific errors in reasoning.
Well, you have non sequitur errors, where the conclusion simply does not logically follow the available facts. For instance, arguing, the stock market went up today, therefore my business idea must be good.
The events are completely unconnected, but the mind just links them for convenience.
Then there are unsupported generalization errors, applying specific facts to a broad generalization without sufficient generalized justification.
Like if a politician meets three struggling small business owners and then generalizes that all small businesses in the state are failing.
Exactly. When statistically that may not be true at all. We also see these strategic attacks that poison the well of public discourse. Poisoning the well errors, for instance, weaken an argument by introducing some tangential self-criticism within the argument itself.
It makes the listener immediately doubt the premise.
And of course, the classic ad hominem attack, where you attack the person's character instead of the argument they presented.
These errors thrive when emotional appeal or sensational context is prioritized over provable rigor. The importance of these concepts is that they give us a classification system, a way to understand structural failures in arguments.
Which leads us directly into the framework for achieving that rigor. The 4 pillars of problem solving defined by the mathematician John H. Mason. It's a mechanism for tackling complexity.
And the first step is specializing.
Mason's method is really the engine of mathematical thinking. It gives us a procedural way to approach any complex challenge. And specializing, as you said, is all about testing a general idea with many specific examples until you gain universal confidence.
The book gives that great Black Friday scenario. Say you're buying a $1,000 laptop. It's 30% off plus 10% tax. The general idea is the formula. The specific example is the $1,000 price point.
Right. And most people instinctively assume the order of calculation matters.
You feel like calculating the discount first will be better because you're applying the tax to a smaller sum.
But only specializing proves or disproves this intuition. Let's run the calculations slowly. If you calculate the discount first, $1,000 minus $300 is $700. Then you add $70 tax, which is 10% of $700.
Total is $770.
If we do tax first, $1,000 plus $100 tax is $1,100. Then apply the 30% discount, which is $330. $1,100 minus $330
is also $770. The results are identical.
And the initial examples proved it for those specific numbers. But to prove it wasn't a fluke, a statistical anomaly, you have to specialize further.
So you plug in an $800 laptop, a $1,500 laptop, or you try different percentages like 35% discount or 15% tax.
And only after that repeated, rigorous testing with distinct examples do you gain the confidence that this isn't luck, but a generalized truth.
So specializing is essentially rigorous, systematic trial and error with distinct variables. Once you've done that, you move to the second pillar, generalizing.
Generalizing is the beautiful conceptual step. You take those proven distinct examples and you transform them into a universal rule.
So in this case, the generalization is the order of applying a percentage discount to percentage tax does not matter.
Provided they are both applied to the same original price or subsequent running total. You achieve this by identifying the mathematical pattern that lies beneath the specifics and replacing them with universal variables like x, y, and z.
So specializing is the necessary justification for why the generalization works. Without it, the generalization is just an intuitive guess, or worse, just confirming your own bias.
Next is conjecturing. This is your best educated guess, or your hypothesis, that you form after some initial specialization. It's what you work with when you haven't fully verified the idea. It remains in a gray area.
Like the court concept of not guilty.
Exactly. A conjecture is plausible, but it's unproven. And this requires a high degree of cognitive humility, doesn't it? You have to acknowledge that your initial idea, even if it's well-researched, is likely to be a failure or only partially correct.
The most famous example is Goldbach's conjecture.
Right. It states that every even number greater than 2 is the sum of 2 prime numbers. It seems incredibly plausible. Mathematicians have tested it often, verifying it for every number up to, I think, 4 times 10 to the 18th power.
But because testing all even numbers to infinity is next to impossible, it can never be definitively verified as always true. It just exists in that perpetual gray area.
Yes. And conjecturing teaches us that the point isn't necessarily proving the conjecture true, but investigating what knowledge is required to guide the next attempt, or identifying the knowledge that would prove it false. It's really the engine of scientific discovery.
The final crucial step is convincing. This is where you test the idea against an outside force.
You present the airtight argument, the generalization, supported by specializing to a skeptic or a foe. Once you've gone through a problem thoroughly, you become too close to it.
Proximity causes bias.
Exactly. You start to subconsciously overlook flaws because you want the argument to be right. That external challenge forces rigorous explanation and verification.
And if your foe, your critical thinker, can't professionally wreck the argument, then all parties can move forward with confidence in the generalization. It shifts the burden of proof from your internal belief to an external shared validity.
And Mason emphasizes that one of the most important parts of problem solving is not getting things right, but getting things wrong and meticulously noting every step of the process. You write down your thoughts, your frustrations, where you get stuck.
That generates the material you need for convincing and generalizing later, and helps you discover more about your own mental processes.
So Mason's method gives us the rigorous framework for solving problems. But how does the physical brain actually execute that rigorous work?
That brings us to the essential cognitive partnership between two distinct modes of thinking.
This is the concept of focused versus diffused thinking. The focused mode is that active, highly attentive effort, that pinpointed beam of light, soaking in information while blocking out distractions. It's the intentional work.
And the diffuse mode is the resting state network, a brighter, bigger beam. This is the subconscious processor. It links new ideas to past experiences when you step away from the active problem.
The author describes that familiar pattern. You focus intently on a complex problem, you hit a seemingly impenetrable roadblock, you close the document, and you walk away.
You go for a walk, brush your teeth, wash dishes.
And while you're engaged in that mundane, low-effort activity, the diffuse mode is working in the background until that aha moment arrives and everything just clicks into place.
But the problem that prevents people from effectively using this natural cycling is the Einstellung effect. This is the mental roadblock that occurs when preconceived ideas hinder the discovery of better, more flexible solutions.
It creates cognitive inflexibility. We think of the classic 9-dot puzzle, where the assumption is that the lines must stay within the boundary, which prevents you from finding the correct answer.
Which relies on extending the lines beyond the dots.
Right. But the effect is constant in real life. Think of a mid-level manager trying to solve a supply chain inefficiency. They were trained years ago on a specific, complex software solution that fixed a similar problem before.
So they spend weeks trying to force the current problem to fit the structure of the old software,
ignoring simpler, more modern, or alternative solutions that don't rely on that particular process. That prior knowledge, the preconceived idea, becomes a literal roadblock.
And this is exactly what happens in education when we adopt the equation-first approach. We assume the formula is the most important takeaway, rather than the overarching concept.
We know the grammar of the math, but not the context where it's useful. We're stuck in the focus mode of just repeating the procedure, unable to shift to the diffuse, creative mode needed for application.
That procedural focus gives us an illusion of competence. Because the formula is neatly copied in our notes or it's instantly searchable on Google, we feel like we know it.
We feel like we could solve the problem if we were pressed, but if you walk away, close the laptop, and try to recall the steps or the concept 24 hours later, you realize you retained very little. The knowledge is accessible, not owned.
So how do we move from memorization to actual owned understanding? The book suggests chunking as the mechanism.
Chunking is the process of sorting raw data into mental files, creating these cognitive building blocks for easier, faster recall. True learning requires both focus input and diffuse processing working together.
You start with the raw data, a complicated lecture, a dense book, which initially makes little sense.
You use focused thinking to grab the key points, like identifying the different sections and colors of a complicated puzzle. But the crucial step, the formation of the chunk, happens next.
That's right. The chunk is actually formed when you step away, and the diffuse mode ties those bits of information together, relating the new idea to your own past experiences and existing mental models.
It's like putting the puzzle pieces together until you have a recognizable subsection, a chunk, that you can access quickly. The more connections your diffuse mind makes, the more resilient and meaningful that chunk becomes.
Which is why active recall, or summoning the material from memory, is so much better than relying on notes or simply rereading the text.
The more you practice conjuring up an idea without external help, the more you wear down those mental pathways. It makes the chunk immediately accessible, even when you're under stress or not in the focused mode.
It's the difference between having the recipe book open on the counter and being able to cook the meal from memory.
The former is competence, the latter is mastery. Thomas Edison and Salvador Dali understood this. They'd often use the moments right before sleep, when the diffuse mode is highly active, to encourage breakthrough insights by keeping the problem actively in their subconscious mind.
It's all about ensuring you shift from those focused, sometimes tunnel vision analytical processes to the creative, abstract thinking necessary to solve novel problems. We need both gears engaged.
Now, let's take these logical frameworks, the rigor of Mason's method and the flexibility of cognitive cycling, and apply them to what Rutherford argues is the biggest conceptual failure in modern analytical thinking.
The difference between linearity and nonlinearity.
The book argues that we are primed to follow linear reasoning because it's simple, it's intuitive, and it offers immediate answers. There are two main destructive principles of linearity.
Additivity and homogeneity.
Additivity states that outputs simply sum up without interaction. If you have two different inputs, the final output is just the sum of the two, with no effect on each other. One fertilizer adds 5 units of nutrients, another adds 3, the total is 8.
Which assumes the components exist in a vacuum without influencing each other.
Precisely. And the second principle, homogeneity, is the assumption that output is directly proportional to the input. 2 times the input equals 2 times the output. If a single employee can process 100 orders a day, then hiring a second identical employee means you should process 200 orders a day.
Linearity works beautifully for simple calculations, like comparing 2 cell phone plans where the cost is purely determined by usage. You draw a straight line graph, find the crossover point, and the decision is made.
But the real world is fundamentally nonlinear. And that linear intuition sets us up for chronic cognitive failure because reality is full of complex feedback loops, diminishing marginal utility, and synergistic interactions that the simple model just ignores.
Diminishing marginal utility is the classic economic principle that helps us understand this. If you are starving, the first sandwich provides immense satisfaction.
The second provides less, and the third provides far less satisfaction than the first, even though the input 1 sandwich is the same. The output, your satisfaction, is not proportional to the continued input.
And that failure to capture the complexity of interactions is key. Rutherford uses 2 great examples. First, the garden gear example.
Right. You combine 2 fertilizers. If they are additive, the soil quality output is simple. But if they interact chemically, and they often do, the soil quality will be determined by that interaction, which the linear model cannot capture.
You might only get 6 units of nutrients, not 8, because one inhibited the other.
Then there's the button-up example, which tackles the homogeneity principle head-on and shows why scaling is almost never linear in business.
If you successfully sell 1 million buttons a year, the linear assumption is that scaling up to 2 million buttons will guarantee 2 times the revenue and profit. This assumption is rampant in entrepreneurial pitches and corporate planning.
But that linear model assumes that scaling doesn't matter. It ignores nonlinear variables that just explode as you grow.
It ignores potential demand fluctuations, which might not be proportional to your supply.
It ignores the fact that import fees often increase nonlinearly past a certain threshold. It ignores shipping time delays, market saturation, and the fact that you might need disproportionately more staff input to manage the logistics of the second million buttons.
If you can't sell those 2 million buttons, your revenue will not grow linearly. It might even shrink due to overhead.
The ultimate failure of linearity in systems thinking is its inability to capture feedback. It fails to consider the effect actions have on their environment and how past decisions cycle back to affect the present. It leads to planning that is always myopic and surprised by unintended consequences.
But here's the critical systems analysis. Why do we still use linear models if they're consistently wrong in complex systems?
Because they're intuitive, they simplify cause and effect, and crucially, they are well suited to the strict quantitative methods of mathematics and the reductionist approach of science. It's inherently easier for scientists, modelers, and media commentators to encode and model two variables with a straight line than to capture all the influencing nonlinear variables in a complex event.
It's the path of least resistance for everyone involved in communicating or analyzing large data sets. Let's map this analytical laziness onto the systems that shape our world.
We can define key actors and look at their incentives. The educational curriculum is a massive actor here. It prioritizes standardized procedural math, incentivizing rote memorization, because that is easy to test and grade at scale.
So the system punishes the diffuse, abstract thinking required to engage with nonlinearity.
And then you have the media and political commentators. They are actors incentivized to simplify complex issues for mass appeal and sensationalism. Nonlinear reality, it's complicated, and here is a bell curve. Doesn't make for a good 30-second soundbite.
So they rely on flawed linear models or sampling errors to grab attention. The incentive is engagement, not rigor.
And the individual thinkeress is incentivized to use the path of least cognitive resistance. Linear thinking. It conserves mental energy, provides quick answer, and avoids the necessary difficulty and time required for the shift to diffuse thinking, which is where true complexity is processed.
And the pervading narratives reinforce these harmful outcomes. The primary narrative we accept is that assumption of homogeneity, that scaling doesn't matter, and that straight-line growth or decline is inevitable.
Which allows for endless sensationalist predictions. This feeds directly into a profoundly damaging systemic failure, the bias loop. Let's look at the famous obesity rate example used by the author.
The National Health and Nutrition Examination Study tracks the increasing trend of overweight Americans. Around the mid-2000s, almost 75% were deemed overweight.
And this led to the shock headline, often amplified by media and public health officials looking for impact, that all Americans would become overweight or obese by 2048.
That prediction was based on a flawed, purely linear regression.
Right. It assumed that if the rate of increase observed between 1970 and 2000 remained constant, it would hit 100% by a certain date. But as the book points out, if the linear rate continued, by 2070, over 115% of Americans would have weight problems.
Which is mathematically and logically absurd. It demonstrates the complete failure of the model.
The real line of growth is fundamentally nonlinear. It has to slow down or flatten as it approaches 100% because inherently there are biological and systemic factors that mean some people will never become overweight.
And the linear model just ignores these hard limits and feedback mechanisms.
The bias loop works like this. Complex phenomena, like obesity rates, are simplified into linear models because they're easy to understand and sensationalize. Scientists and the media use these simple models to explain reality and create shocking projections.
The public accepts the simplified, shocking prediction, which then confirms the utility and necessity of simple models.
And this perpetuates the simplistic perception of complex issues, ignoring all the crucial nonlinear factors and feedback mechanisms.
This systems analysis shows why the book's ideas are so crucial for understanding modern institutions, particularly politics and governance, where linear assumptions often trap us in false dichotomies.
The best demonstration of this is the Swedish conundrum shared by Jordan Ellenberg, which addresses the political debate over welfare and prosperity using a simple graph that highlights the difference between linear and nonlinear analysis.
So you had the Cato Institute viewpoint, which showed a linear downward sloping line. The more Swedish you are, meaning the more welfare spending and state support, the lower your overall prosperity.
This perspective saw the U.S. implementing the Affordable Care Act as an alarming move toward a communist apocalypse.
Because this linear perspective forces a binary choice. Welfare is either good or it is bad. It argues that because Sweden, which is very Swedish, is cutting benefits, The policy must be failing.
And any country moving in that direction is making a mistake. The straight line assumes that moving further right or left must always lead to a decrease in prosperity from wherever you currently are.
But the nonlinear perspective, the one supported by complex systems theory, completely changes the analysis. This is the bell curve model.
Exactly. The bell curve shows that maximal prosperity is not at either extreme, the hypothetical libertarian utopia of zero-state intervention, or the communist apocalypse of total state control. It's somewhere in the middle, at the peak of the curve.
The curve acknowledges diminishing marginal returns for everything.
The first dollar of welfare is incredibly effective. The 100th dollar is less so. This means that the U.S., when it implemented the ACA, was still on the left side of the curve. It was moving up toward maximal prosperity by adding state support because its system was previously too far to the libertarian side.
Conversely, Sweden, by that point, had become too Swedish. It was sitting past the peak on the right side of the curve, where adding more benefits was starting to yield negative returns.
They needed to cut, benefits move left to cycle back toward the point of maximal prosperity.
So both actions, the U.S. increasing welfare and Sweden cutting welfare, can be valid, beneficial choices at the same time, based entirely on where they are situated on the complexity curve.
Nonlinear thinking means which way you should go depends entirely on where you already are. The linear perspective forces a false dichotomy that simplifies complex political debate. The nonlinear perspective allows for nuance and systems-level analysis.
That is cognitive empowerment applied to governance. We see this conceptual rigor applied directly to our everyday lived experience too, especially financial decisions, where we often confuse two key concepts: probability and expected value.
Probability is the likelihood of something happening. It's what we intuitively focus on. Expected value, however, is the long-term average outcome of that event.
And the gambling and lottery system are based entirely on exploiting our human tendency to confuse the two. We focus on the small probability of a massive win rather than the long-term expected loss.
Let's use the simple lottery example. Say we have 10 million possible combinations, a $7 million grand prize, and tickets cost $1. The probability of winning with one ticket is 1 in 10 million. It's a tiny probability, but it exists.
But the critical factor is the expected value, EX, which is the sum of the probability of all outcomes multiplied by the value of those outcomes.
So if you spend $10 million buying every single ticket, you guarantee the win, but you win $7 million and lose $3 million. Your expected value is a negative number, negative $3 million.
This simple model confirms that the lottery is a tax on the mathematically illiterate. Even for a huge jackpot, the expected value for the player is almost always negative in the long run.
But this concept of expected value is what mathematically defines modern commerce and the entire apparatus of risk management, particularly in the insurance industry. Actuarial science is a clear institutional application of expected value.
Insurance companies have to predict how much money they will need to pay out in claims to the insured over a policy period. They manage random variables, the frequency of an event and the severity of the loss, using historical data translated into probability.
Let's look closely at the structure for determining a car insurance premium, as Rutherford breaks it down. The core formula is premium equals the expected number of claims times the expected amount of each claim.
Premium E hashtag of claims, X E amount of claim. This formula is how the company decides to charge you. They're calculating their long-term average loss per customer before factoring in overhead and profit.
So first, we need the expected number of claims, which uses historical data for frequency. Let's assume the probability distribution for a group of insured drivers is a 50% probability of 0 claims, 30% of 1 claim, 10% of 2 claims, and 10% of 3 claims.
To find the expected value of the number of claims, EX, we multiply the probability of each outcome by the number of claims and then sum them all up.
Right. The calculation looks like this. 0.50 by 0 plus 0.30 by 1 plus 0.0 by 2 plus 0.5 by 3. That simplifies to 0 plus 0.30 plus 0.20 plus a 0.30, which equals 0.80.
That's the expected number of claims per insured person over the policy period. So on average, they expect 8 claims for every 10 customers.
Okay, so 0.80 is our expected frequency. Next, we need to calculate the severity of the expected cost or dollar value of a claim. Let's assume the probability distribution for cost based on historical accidents is $7,500 with a 15% probability, $15,000 with a 35% probability, $22,500 with a 40% probability, and $30,000 with a 10% probability.
The expected value of the claim amount is calculated similarly, multiplying the cost by its probability. 0.15 by $7,500, plus 0.35 by $15,000, plus 0 pounds and 40 by $22,500, plus 0.90 like $30,000.
That totals $11,125 from the first group, plus $5,250 from the second, plus $9,000 from the third, and $3,000 from the final group. That sums up to $18,375. That is the average cost the company expects to pay out per claim.
Now for the final step, we multiply our two expected values, 0.88, the expected frequency, times $18,375, the expected severity.
And while those specific numbers are just for demonstration, the process shows how probability and expected value mathematically define modern risk management. The whole system relies on the rigorous application of mathematics to manage random variables based on historical data. Understanding this structure is profound cognitive empowerment. It prevents us from simply accepting a premium or an investment risk as a neutral, external fact. It gives us the tools to analyze the underlying structure of the decision being presented to us.
This mathematical rigor ties back directly to the importance of critical thinking, the capacity to analyze facts, formulate ideas, interpret information, and draw warranted conclusions.
And critical thinking differs from mathematical truth because it isn't always about finding a single true or false conclusion. It's about forming a sound opinion or decision based on interpreting complex, often contradictory information.
And that interpretation needs to be guided by key traits like persistence, rigor, openness, and diligence.
The reason critical thinking is so essential is that it allows us to acknowledge our emotions, which are powerful, nonlinear factors, without being solely controlled by them. It provides a framework to process morality and logistics at the same time.
The Heinz dilemma, the moral conundrum of a husband stealing an expensive life-saving drug for his dying wife, is the perfect illustration of why critical thinking needs mathematical structure.
If you approach this dilemma with pure, focused emotion, you quickly arrive at an intuitive, linear answer. Yes, he should steal it because life is more important than property.
But critical thinking forces you to engage the diffuse mode and analyze all the facts. The cost, the druggist's right to profit from his labor and discovery, the concept of property itself, and the societal value of upholding the law.
It forces you to judge the credibility of sources and reasons and be open-minded enough to consider opposing viewpoints, like the fact that if the druggist gives away the drug, he may not be able to invest in future research.
Mathematical thinking doesn't give you the answer, but it provides the logical toolset to strip away that immediate emotional bias and analyze the underlying structural logic of the dilemma before you reach a warranted conclusion.
So let's connect all these powerful ideas back to the broader themes of crisis and perception and what the book helps us see differently about systems.
The primary connection is the shift from systems versus individual blame. The book really encourages us to stop viewing analytical weakness, that inability to solve complex, nonlinear problems, as a personal, innate flaw.
It highlights it as a structural, institutional failure of education. That system prioritized procedural memory over developing the flexible thinking muscles, specializing, generalizing, conjecturing, and that focused diffuse partnership that are required for tackling complex, real-world systems.
If the system only teaches you to follow a recipe, it's a systemic failure when you can't invent a new one.
Secondly, the book profoundly reveals the power hidden inside neutral processes. Quantitative models like linear regression or expected value calculations feel neutral and objective, but they are incredibly powerful tools. They actively shape financial outcomes, drive market predictions, and frame political narratives.
Like the bell curve versus the straight line.
Understanding the limitations of these models, for instance, the inherent bias toward linearity and simplicity, is a profound form of cognitive empowerment. It allows us to question the structure of the argument itself, not just the outcome being presented. It lets us ask, what underlying mathematical assumption is driving this policy?
And finally, it addresses moral narratives embedded in institutions. When we tolerate vague language and cognitive fallacies in public discourse, non sequiturs, ad hominem attacks, unsupported generalizations, we allow emotionally driven, non-factual arguments to thrive.
Mathematical thinking, through its insistence on precision and provable reasoning, provides the antidote. It reveals how logical rigor is essential for sound institutional decisions and strips away the ambiguity that allows emotional manipulation to hide flawed structures or weak arguments.
The system of public debate benefits from ambiguity. Mathematical thinking demands clarity.
This deep dive shows that mathematical thinking is not just about crunching numbers. It's a synthesis of analytical, synthetic, critical, and creative processes. It forces us to understand that complexity is the norm. And the intuitive, simple answer, the linear path, the immediate emotional response, is often the profoundly wrong answer in the real world of nonlinear systems.
The value of this perspective lies in developing mental flexibility and intellectual humility. Developing the ability to consciously alternate between focused and diffuse thinking and rigorously test every conjecture is the path to overcoming the Einstellung effect and achieving better insights in any field.
Whether you are managing global policy, designing a new product, or just trying to understand the nuances of the political spectrum.
That said, this perspective also raises some crucial questions for us to explore in our own lives. Questions that the book's principles highlight but don't fully answer.
For one, if relying on external data like copious notes or immediate access to Google creates an illusion of competence, how can we better integrate spaced repetition and self-testing or active recall into our daily routines to fight that complacency?
How do we truly own the knowledge we consume rather than just accessing it when needed? We know that practicing recall, maybe right before sleep as the author suggests, strengthens memory and chunk formation.
But how do we systematically apply that principle to all the information we try to absorb daily, moving it from our external notes into resilient mental chunks?
And knowing that linearity is intuitive, but often wrong, what systems in our daily lives, from education and financial planning to how we analyze news stories or social media engagement, are currently suffering from the systemic error of assuming straight-line growth or simple additivity?
Where are the bias loops in our personal financial decisions or our assessment of risk? It's an ongoing challenge in a world flooded with data that is often presented with linear assumptions. It forces us to become radically skeptical of any simple explanation and to always search for the missing feedback loop.
We want to thank Albert Rutherford, the author of Mathematical Thinking, for people who hate math.
We encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.